Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Another exciting day in DC news. Wow. So the we've gotten the first teaser for the upcoming Lanterns series in James Gunn's DC universe. Now, this universe has been something of a joke so far, and it's interesting to see the audience response to it all, right? The Superman movie has gotten, I would say it's fair to say the response has been mixed. I feel a bit more strongly about it because I do believe, Superman's character was reduced to acting like Superboy instead of Superman, and there was just no stoicism whatsoever ingrained into the character. Um, I'm not personally a huge Superman fan, but I've enjoyed the character in specific moments, right? The most I've enjoyed him is in the Justice League animated series, right? And my perception is Superman works best when he's part of an ensemble, right? When he's part of a group of characters where his Boy Scout attitude and this perfectionist rhetoric that always revolves around the character makes some sort of sense when there's someone with conflicting views or opposing views in the room with him. I think that's truly when Superman works, and I think there's evidence to even support that, because if you look at all his TV shows, the ones that have been successful, Smallville, it's him and Lex essentially. Superman and Lois, all those shows, it's always Superman and someone else, Superman and someone else. And I do believe that is how Superman works best in a modern era, because um, I don't personally think the character works as well anymore, because the whole persona of characters who don't have any flaws. He's supposed to be this perfect Boy Scout that makes the right decision all the time, and he's always hopeful. I can recognize that there's a space for hopeful characters, but we have to admit that Superman sort of takes that to the extreme, right? And when you have a character that is invulnerable and impervious to harm, that makes their decision to be brave, it takes away from that. And I think that's one of the reasons people sort of resonated with Frank Miller's view in The Dark Knight. And there's a line in that where Bruce says to Superman, men are brave, and it's true. It's actually true. In order to be brave, you do have to recognize, feel, and overcome fear, right? You don't get bravery without it. And if Superman as a character is just impervious to anything and there's no consequences for anything that he does, he can't really be brave. And so it makes it a bit difficult to align with the character. So I no hate, right? I don't want the Superman fans to come for me, but that's just all been my perspective on the character and what makes it difficult to resonate with him a bit, because I'm not perfect and most people are not perfect. And so people can relate more to Bruce Wayne, even though they're not a billionaire, but he does feel pain. He does have to make hard choices and live with the consequences of those choices. So that makes him more relatable. And it's the same thing with Spider-Man, who is now essentially outpaced Superman in popularity. So those are the elements that I think are missing from Superman, and I don't think there's a way to fix that, because if you try to change him, which I believe Zack Snyder tried to do, to humanize him, then people respond, negatively. But I'm not a huge fan of the Zack Snyder films, but I do think Man of Steel is better than James Gunn's Superman. So maybe there is something that we can take away from that, right? But anyway, back to Lanterns, right? This is a tough one for me because I grew up watching the Justice League animated series, right? So those were some of my favorites in DC to watch, and John Stewart is the lantern that I grew up with, so I'm not as, as knowledgeable on Hal's accomplishments or what Hal's history is. And Hal's persona, again, just never really resonated with me personally. I just found John's more, or I think one of the reasons why John works so well for me in the animated series, again, it's the ensemble of characters, because John was always that hard edged by the books kind of guy, a military guy, and he would always be placed in a room with either Wally West or Bruce. And it was always interesting to see how they play off each other, and the dialogue was just always interesting. And it made the characters interesting on a whole. Whenever I've gotten Hal Jordan on screen, um, he's portrayed as just a bit, comical and goofy, which in my mind, I already feel Wally West already fits that role. And so I've never really resonated with Hal Jordan as much. But saying all of that and watching the trailer, I despise what they have done with the character. Right now, people are going off again about the lantern uniform, and again, as usual, we're focusing on the wrong thing here. But we'll address the outfit first, right? Obviously, it's dull. It lacks color, and who in their right mind greenlit this lantern that is set on Earth? A lot of valid criticisms in there. Now that we've taken this, this this basically space police group, and we've moved them to a small town to solve a mystery there. Oh, I've seen a lot of excuses being made saying that things will get more exciting as the series progresses, or we don't know what they're gonna give us, so let's wait. Look, a lot of this is just cope. It just is, because the real answer to a lot of why everything is grounded, the reason for that is just the budget. It's really that simple. I'm not sure why we're making all these excuses. It's the budget, right? There is no way to realistically do a Lantern TV show unless you start with the budget that Game of Thrones had, probably in its later seasons, in fact. Right? You would have to start with a large budget. There's just no other way to do it, because there's just a lot of effects, and that would have to be included here. And you see that in the trailer, where it's absent any of that. The lantern glow, not even the ring, none of it gives any color. It's all just saturated and dead. And yeah, it's just a budget, right? So they set it in this small town, and as we go through the trailer, of course, we see the usual messages being pushed through. The girl boss, sheriff in the town, laying down the law about what she's going to do if they don't play by her rules. And I guarantee you, at some point, there's going to be some instance where she upstages one of the two characters, or teaches them what it means to be, you know, I don't know, some valuable lesson. Insert valuable lesson from woman somewhere. Yeah, we all know it's coming, right? So the trailer was a lot of what we expected. The costume looks dull and boring. But as I've said, you know, and as I think about the costume, it just makes me remember the Ryan Reynolds film, and how we clowned on that movie. And it is a terrible movie. Let's not, you know, revise history here. It was a bad movie, but at least the costumes looked okay. The costumes looked okay, especially Sinestro. I think he was done extremely well. And Mark Strong was fantastic in that role, right? We just got a horrible movie, and I'm not sure Ryan Reynolds was the best cast for Hal either. Uh, but the costumes looked okay. But yeah, aside from the costumes, right? This small town mystery that we're going for, and I've seen someone post on X that best this would have been best suited for a Martian Manhunter introduction. And I think they are absolutely right about that. right? If you took an sort of X-Files route, yeah, we need to talk about that at some point. But if you took the X-Files route, um, with Martian Manhunter in a small town, that could have been something fantastic. But the Green Lantern Corps is supposed to be this, off-planet excursion, at a Star Trek even, where they're solving these mysteries in the galaxy, and it's a bit ridiculous to now want to set this in a small town. As I've said, the obvious answer to it is just the budget, and what they're hoping to do is to see whether this first season performs well enough, where they can then get a larger budget and give us all the colors that we want. Problem is, if you're not going to be authentic to the characters, people aren't going to show up. Uh, I'm sure they'll get the normies, which comes back to what I've said before about, yeah, the usual suspects or the usual messaging about getting in the female viewers, and making this a bit more dramatic to get those viewers in. Again, you see it in the trailer where this dynamic between Hal and John, where the Lantern Ring usually chooses its next host, but for whatever reason, we're going through this season where we're treating the ring as though it's a mantle that has to be earned by the next person in line, when that's not how it works at all. It's just a bit strange. We saw Hal fly into the air. There's no green hue to suggest that he's using his lantern ring. The trailer was much like the God of War tease. It was fine, but in terms of a Lantern TV show, it was disappointing, right? I think the casting is okay. Uh, that's the only thing from the teaser that really works. Everything else just doesn't make sense for a Lantern TV show. It makes sense if it was just a one-off TV show that they were just making up, and we're just following these two cops in town or something to that effect, sort of like Lethal Weapon or something. If we're going down that road, sure, it could work. But as a Lantern TV show, it just does not work, because you do need the magic of the Lantern ring. That needs to be front and center in order for this to be a Lantern show. Nobody reads comics to watch two lanterns sit in a car and talk. It's just not realistic. But as I've said before, I think people are missing the bigger issue with the trailer, and that is the dynamic between Hal and John. As I said earlier, John's personality, what in comics and animation and so on, he's a larger than life character who's full of joy and reckless. And what we see is now a broken man in Hal. A broken man that seems to have lost his faith in how things work, and he's coming towards the end of his life, and he needs to pass on to the next generation. That is the problem with this trailer, and it's a recurring theme that we've seen Hollywood consistently push, where they treat male characters, particularly older male characters, as things to be discarded. Now, if you look at, I think perhaps I didn't get a chance to cover this story, but this is a good time to actually bring it up, because it does tie into the problem with this trailer somewhat. DC's Jim Lee admits manga could be better than American comics, right? A few weeks ago, Jim Lee made some comments relating to manga and anime in Japan compared to the performance of comics in the West. Uh, President, Publisher, and Chief CCO of DC Comics, Jim Lee, shared an intriguing weaving insight about the state of American comics and how they fare against manga as an alternative form of print entertainment. When speaking to Nikkei Trend about his career, he expounded on the competition and commercial edge that manga has over the comics-related medium, He says the stories told in Japan manga and anime are incredibly powerful. I often find myself wondering what is missing in Western comics and why aren't they able to achieve the same flavor. Also, I think manga has an advantage over American comics, which are mostly about superheroes, and that's where the majority of sales and readers are concentrated. All right, so Jim is almost there. He's almost there, right? He highlights one of the issues, which is, anime and manga has a wider variety in terms of what they offer to their audience, but he misses the mark in why they do that or how it's done, right? Um, in Japan, they can make a series about a man sitting in a park feeding pigeons, um, and they're making that story about, they're making a story for people who are interested in a man sitting in a park feeding pigeons, right? They're recognizing who their target audience is, and that's who they're making it for. I remember reading recently about, I think it's an upcoming anime, or maybe the manga already exists, about these group of women who are doing laundry. And I thought to myself, that's interesting. Everyone has to do laundry. This would most likely be targeting young women. But if this were taken into the West, people would, feminists would complain nonstop about how misogynistic it is to create content around women either being in the kitchen or women being in the laundry room doing laundry at home, right? And that is the problem that Jim is ignoring. They consistently try to create this content for everyone, and then they end up pleasing no one. And to sort of tie this back to the lantern issue here is the depiction of Hal Jordan as this broken and defeated man that we've seen time and time again. We've seen it with Joel in Last of Us, and we've seen it in Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. Indiana Jones, it's the same thing. The West has this perception that older male characters should be discarded. That's what it comes down to. If you look at manga in the West, in the East, Master Roshi, Jiraiya, the third Hokage, I'm blanking on his name, but that guy who leads Soul Society in Bleach. When Japan depicts older male characters, they are wise, they are powerful, they're people you do not want to cross. They're not treated as men to be discarded or men that have nothing else to offer. And this rhetoric that Hollywood now pushes, again, it's just a deconstruction of masculinity, that when men get to this point, they should be reflecting on their past mistakes and what they should change versus reflecting on their past and how they can pass on those lessons to the next generation. And one of the reasons Hollywood does this, again, it comes back to just, this need to appease to a wider audience, a wider feminine audience. It's that older men typically have ideas about roles for men and roles for women that Hollywood now believes to be archaic and outdated. And so their first job is to deconstruct those men and make them appear, make them appear weak, broken, admit that how they've done things in the past has been wrong and they need correction. That is why they paint all these broken characters, to deconstruct masculinity, particularly the older men who need to lead the younger men or present an example for the younger generation coming up. And when those young men don't have that, that older figure to look to, then they themselves become feminine. And that is what Hollywood is trying to achieve. And Jim misses the point here, because if you are a Hal Jordan fan who has grown up reading Hal Jordan and watching Hal Jordan and wanting to see Hal Jordan on screen for so many years, and this is what you're presented with, a broken and defeated man who once had joy in his job. One of the things that was unique about Hal is in most cases, when superheroes get power and find themselves in this position where they have to take on this responsibility, they're sort of taken aback by it, and it feels more like a burden that they have to carry, right? For a lot of heroes, it's that way, especially the ones who come into power after losing someone, right? They're usually resistant, and they're hesitant to take on the responsibility. But Hal is one of those cases where he just got the power, and he was like, yeah, all right, I'll do it. Caught me in. And that's the kind of character that he is, right? He wouldn't complain. He recognized what he could achieve with this power, and he was immediately all in. And to see, for the fans of that character to now see that this is what his portrayal is, Jim has now missed the mark, because you've now told those fans who have been looking forward to this, who believe that they should be the target audience for this Hal Jordan character, that they're no longer the target audience for Hal. The target audience for Hal is now, women who need to see this character broken, stripped apart, deconstructed, admit that his views are outdated. So these men who grew up buying your comics and watching and supporting and buying toys and all of that for DC, they're saying that, the Hal Jordan character is they're no longer the target audience for Hal Jordan as a character. Now, if you're writing Hal for the male audience, for those men who have supported DC, if you were writing Hal for those men, you would go something like the F1 movie that came out last year. Right? The movie had its flaws, but it was one of the few films that I watched last year, particularly because of how well it was done in terms of depicting an older character not even coming towards the end, but getting up there in age. But throughout that entire film, the character did not put his dreams on the back end. He did not act as though he was burnt out, even though he was not the same useful person that he was. But toward the end of the movie, his choice was, I could give this up and hand it over to the younger generation, or I still love to do this thing. What's stopping me from continuing to do it until the day I die? And so at the end of the movie, when traditionally, at least in New Hollywood, you would expect him to throw in the towel and give up and move on and go and settle down with his new girlfriend or whatever the case is. The F1 movie did something different, and he said, "I'll see you down the road," to the woman that he had sort of fallen in love with. He said to her, "I'll see you down the road, because I have other things I need to accomplish. I still love driving. I can still learn." And so he goes to Baja to learn how to drive these monster trucks, right? And that is that authenticity, that passion and drive is what Hal Jordan, as an older man, should still possess, even at that point. But again, as I've said, it's a deconstruction of what the male is supposed to be, what Hollywood now wants the male to, or wants masculinity to be. And so they've broken down Hal, making, he just comes across as this defeated person. And that's what they're trying to sell, because that's the drama that they need to sell to the female audience. I don't particularly have any thoughts on Stewart's casting. I think he's fine as an actor. He seems fine. I've not seen him in anything. He seems to have been one of the actors rising in popularity, but I haven't really seen him act in anything. He seemed okay in the trailer, but as I said, the main problem here is just the entire dynamic, of painting Hal as this broken man, and I'm not sure what John's backstory is going to be in this, iteration of the story, because the whole body cop thing could work. I just grow tired of the deconstruction of these male characters, particularly the older, more experienced characters, and treating them as though they're something to be discarded. Right. So that is my, that is where I draw the line. The mystery, we don't know yet know what they're trying to solve, but I would assume it's some aliens causing havoc somewhere in the town, and I need to solve that. But the question is, at the end of the film, what then happens, or the TV show, what happens to Hal? Is this a situation where Hal sacrifices himself? Because I can't see. Someone would have to correct me if I'm wrong. Whether it's possible for the lanterns to hand over their ring to someone, or they have to die. Yeah, my history on that is a bit muddy. It's been a while. Um, so the question is, are they going to kill Hal at the end of this season and have John take up the mantle, which again would just rub people the wrong way? There's already been a debate over decades about John as a lantern, and people feeling as though he's stealing his backstory from Hal. There's always been that debate around, um, and I've personally disliked when they do that. Some of the DC animated movies have done it where when John gets his ring, they sort of use Hal's backstory to give him the ring, and I don't know why they would do that. So there's some merit to a lot of the concerns, some of the concerns that people have there, and I would hate for them to tread the same ground in this series as well. In fact, I'm not even sure why we're going this route of Hal handing it over to John. I don't like that either. Just make it about Hal or make it about John. I do not see why we need to do this mentor mentee thing, because I think in either case you're going to rub somebody the wrong way, and you're never going to be able to please everyone. I know that, but again, this is something that's been long debated where John and Hal is concerned for decades. So I'm not sure why you would kick the hornet's nest here and choose to go that direction. It's just very bizarre. So I would have just preferred if they just gone with John or Hal. And maybe they are trying to get ahead of that by using both, because they figured if they tried to use one or the other, then people would maybe get riled up. But so what? Um, yeah, so we'll see where it goes. We've just gotten a teaser so far. The glaring problems are what they are. It's the small town mystery versus the this galaxy wide corp that is supposed to be solving intergalactic you know um quests, and it's you've not essentially stripped everything that makes lanterns and made it very grounded. That's the obvious problem. The one that's not so obvious for me, it's the depiction of Hal Jordan and this trend in Hollywood to sort of deconstruct and break down and make all these once hopeful characters now hopeless, and broken. Yeah, that's not something that I'm particularly interested in seeing. So, as we get more information, we'll continue to cover news related to this Green Lantern series. I'm not sure whether we'll get even beyond season one, considering everything that is happening over at DC at the moment, and the Paramount deal that's now in effect. Although that will take a few years before, well, at least a year, I would say, before you see any real changes happening once the deal is concluded, because it's still very much not yet finalized. I mean, it's finalized between the two parties, but the government still needs to give their okay. So we'll see. I do suspect that Gunn's DCU is coming to a halt, particularly given Superman's performance, which people can say it was great or not, but it's clearly did not meet their expectations. That without a doubt is true, and I doubt very much that Supergirl will exceed Superman's sales. Maybe some miracle could happen and she does, but even if it does, um, unless unless it makes this ridiculous amount of money and gets to a billion or 1.5 billion, it would need to do astronomical numbers to save the DCU, right? It would have to perform beyond what they expect to save the DCU. If it doesn't, yeah, that's it for the DCU. It's done there. And the Supergirl thing was a mistake in the first place. But again, it comes back to a lot of this messaging where they need to bring in a girl boss power in there to you know to appease the fans who are saying, if you only have male characters, then it's just misogynistic, because there's no reason why we needed to have a Supergirl film. There just isn't. All right. The character is not particularly powerful in popular in mainstream. She just isn't. Uh, and once you've seen the trailers for Supergirl, you know her talking down to Superman and treating him like a child, even calling him names, and so it's just yeah, it's the same message. It's the same message. That's the only reason they bring in these female characters. It's to talk down to the male characters, either to deconstruct them and berate them. It's the same message that we're seeing. So I don't imagine she will perform particularly well. And as I've said before, these stories are male stories. Whenever you're telling stories about bravery, adventure, science fiction, these things are the male domain. They just are. And the sooner we can recognize that and focus on that target audience, the thing that Jim has, you know, so clearly overlooked in his examination of anime and manga, it's that they're successful because they know their target audience, and they know that their target audience are largely males, and so they have a specific category for shonen to appeal to those that fan base. Although I have my own issues with with anime and manga over the last 2 decades, because they have slowly become a bit more westernized, and we have seen feedback from a lot of Japanese creators over the past few months. I believe the guy behind Evangelion had come out and said, anime and manga needs to remain Japanese, and this is something that Hayao Miyazaki has been saying for years, that he doesn't love the where anime has come, because it has become westernized. And one example I like to use to demonstrate that to people is look at the history of Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball when it started and what it is today. When Dragon Ball started, it was very much a male coming of age story. It was Goku, his grandfather Gohan, who found him and was raising him, right? Male coming of age story. You did have Bulma in there somewhere, but she was a supporting role. And this is how a lot of all the traditional stories start. Male coming of age story, female character supporting. And you can watch the progression of Dragon Ball to see the decline of not only, Western comics, but a lot of, a lot of the problems with anime as it is today as well. So we started out with Dragon Ball. Goku was, as any kid would be, very playful, but he still embodied a lot of those characteristics that a male character would. And then as he got older, and we got to the tournament, it was still very much the tournament was still it still had a very dark edge to it. We had Piccolo, evil Piccolo at the time, who was just bodying people. Goku was a very stern character. Interestingly, people seem to forget when Goku first came on the scene, or when he was presented to us as an adult, he wasn't this goofy, ridiculous character that we currently have now. In Dragon Ball, he did have playful moments, but he was very much a serious character, and he took he took the fights very seriously. We had Chi Chi come in at some point, but when Chi Chi was first introduced, when she was a child and he was a child, she was a very playful young woman. She, very timid and so on. Then when she came to the tournament, obviously she had been training because she started to get Goku to honor his arrangement to marry her, right? So they still presented Chi-Chi as a strong woman, but she was still very feminine in that way. And then we skipped towards the Frieza arc, and then you quickly notice the well, between the Frieza arc and the Cell arc, I would say between those two are mostly the Cell saga. And you quickly notice that the women started to berate, Chi-Chi started to berate Goku. She would punch him, hit him, call him names. Goku was largely absent from his son Gohan's life. So they were presenting Goku as some sort of deadbeat dad for the most part. Piccolo had to be the one who trained him. And so through Piccolo, there was still some semblance of masculinity there. But for the large part, Goku continued to become more silly, more of a bumbling idiot that doesn't recognize that he needs to be there for his family, or he's always joking around and flying off and ditching his responsibilities. Um, a lot of that, right? And Chi just got worse and worse. She'd get louder and louder, and she would say to Gohan things like, he doesn't want to become like his father and things like that. And you slowly see the Western values seeping into the anime, and because this was all of these things that I've just described is what the West did in sitcoms and comedies for the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where they would have the male character who's the bumbling idiot, who's incompetent, and the strong boss girl who is constantly yelling at him and shouting at him and telling him what to do. And so Dragon Ball Z started to adopt a lot of those principles. And you saw Goku become like Chandler. And yeah, that's directionally. Once you look at it, where the characters begun, and you see how they progressed as they became more Western, and this closely ties with the with anime becoming more popular in the West. So as anime became more popular, the artists in Japan started to change the characters to appeal more and more to the West. So fast forward to today, Dragon Ball Z went from a male coming of age story to, we now need to have Videl, who's a boss girl. We need to have Pan, who's a boss girl. I believe Vegeta now has a daughter who's now yeah. So it's now okay. We need to make Dragon Ball Z about the women equally as the men now. And yeah, we now have a female Boo character, a female Saiyan. I won't get into all of it, but like I said, look at the trajectory from where we began with Dragon Ball, from the male coming of age story, lessons about masculinity, responsibility, and all of that, and where we are today, where a character like Vegeta is getting slapped and berated by a woman. That is the trajectory for Western comics, and that is where unfortunately anime and manga has started to shift, and that is one of the reasons why you've seen manga artists come out recently to say, yeah, we need to return to form. But the unfortunate truth is, especially for a lot of the anime fans who are, saying, yeah, we need to get back to what was good, they've already been indoctrinated because what they have enjoyed for the large part have all been feminized already. The truly good anime that depicted, anime at its peak were stories from the 70s and 80s. Yeah, everything after that was Japan slowly adopting Western values. And you see it in the characters and the protagonists that are being presented. Deku from My Hero Academia, who, this character that is constantly whining and crying. There's no stoicism anywhere at the moment in anime. Maybe there are one or two exceptions. I've largely sort of fell off from anime because of what I'm seeing, and it's just all terrible or mostly terrible. There are no stoic characters anymore. Yeah, it's just characters that are now being made to appeal to the feminized audience. So both East and West are facing the same challenge. I would just say manga is slightly behind because of the yeah, manga is slightly behind because of they're still trying to cater to specific target audiences, and that has sort of shielded them from some of the damage. But even they are seeing decline in sales compared to what they were doing before. Obviously, the Western comics are all about falling apart. We've had a recent string of popular comics like Absolute Batman and so on, which uh, it's not my thing personally. The character, whether it's Absolute Batman, Absolute Wonder Woman, or Absolute Superman, these characters, they're only in name. They're in name only, right? Bruce Wayne he doesn't have Bruce's personality or characteristics. Superman's entire background is changed. So they're in name only, and it's a result of the era that we're in now, similar to the Boys TV show on Amazon, where, it's just shock value and just shock value, and that's it. How can we catch the audience off guard? Right? That's the era that we're currently in with Western comics. But the problem with that is it's enjoyable in the moment, but it doesn't last, and it's not memorable, right? These aren't things that will stand the test of time, because if you do read the Absolute comics, the plots are not particularly good. The art style is fun. So, and again, there is a place for this. I'm not saying it shouldn't exist. There is a place for it for people to enjoy this, but this really shouldn't be what we're looking at as a mainline story. Uh, but yeah, I mean, we'll see. People are desperate for something good. We can only hope that the Absolute series inspires people to tell even better stories, rather than just trying to copy what they've done and focus more on the shock value of it, and what can we do to push the boundaries, yeah, with violence. And yeah, that's fine. As I said, it's okay, but the stories for that people truly find memorable and still think about or return to years later, it's not the ones with the most violence, or yeah, it's just not. So yeah, so I mean, I'm glad the Absolute series, it's actually doing well, but I think we need to look beyond that, right? We need to look beyond that and see what is working, what isn't working. And more importantly, as I said, we just need to remember who the target audience is. And at the end of the day, the target audience for comics are still young boys, young men, and even older men. Because we've discussed before in some of my other videos, the origin of a lot of these stories over time. We've evolved from telling stories over campfires to, or even before that, we've evolved from writing, depictions on cave walls to telling stories around campfires to theater to TV to film to video games and comics. So these things are just another way of human storytelling and how that has evolved over our entire existence. And we need to safeguard these stories, right? We need to safeguard these stories. And we do that by remembering, who exactly these stories need to cater to. So yeah, that's it, guys. Thanks very much for tuning in. We'll continue to follow the Green Lantern news. Hopefully, as more is revealed, we get more. We get more hopeful, a more hopeful Hal Jordan, that potentially won't be killed off or won't be made out to be some broken, desperate man who has nothing else to live for. We've seen it played out in entertainment for the past few decades now. Who is this being made for? It's definitely not the young men, or it shouldn't be. You definitely need a better message than that. So, yeah, we'll keep on the news and see what DC has in store for us. Thanks very much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.